is Mousie, and welcome to a very special video on how to make paper. So I've been wanting to learn how to make paper for quite a while now, and I thought this would be a cool thing to film because I was planning on doing it anyway for Cthulhu Paper and more, and I figured I would take you guys on that journey with me. So I'm pretty excited for this, and I hope you guys enjoy this as well. So what you'll need is a lot of paper. You can use scraps of paper, newspaper, all just paper in general, just scraps, that sort of thing. The one thing you want to make sure is that it's not waxed, and it can't be glossy or shiny paper. So that's the first thing you're going to want to make sure you have, is the paper. Now, depending on what method you're using, I myself am using a frame method, so I'm going to give the directions for that. That way it keeps it a little less confusing. Yeah, so if you're using the frame method, like we are in this video, you'll need a wooden frame of sorts and some window mesh. We'll be making this after we get the paper kind of started. Next, you'll need a container. Woo! Magical, magical, magical pin. Pin? What was I saying there? I don't know. You'll also need a basin if you're using wooden frame. Sorry, I've already got water in this. I'm using this to soak the paper, and it's already got some water, and I've already put some paper in there because you gotta kind of let it sit for quite a while. Obviously you'll need water, and if you're making stationery paper, aka you don't want the ink to bleed through to the other side of the paper when you're using it, you're gonna want liquid starch. Good old liquid starch. And of course you'll need some sponges. I have a little bit of felt because there were some tutorials that I looked over that recommended using felt to help pat down the paper dry, not just the sponges. And I also have a towel. So there's a lot of different methods out there. I do recommend looking up a few of them like I have, because I wanted to see all the different ways that you make it and figure out a way to make it on my own. Now, there are two ways you can make the pulp of the paper. Now, this is super duper important. You can either use a blender or a mortar and pestle. I am using my bullet blender, which is over here. Here's the cup for it. I'm using my bullet blender, and hopefully it should be fine. If it's not, I'll let you guys know not to use your favorite blender. Maybe get like a really cheap blender, I don't know. But it honestly should be fine. Just in theory, it should be completely fine. So I'm using a blender. This is Mousie from the future, here to tell you to not use a bullet blender. It's not broken or anything, it's just not powerful enough to make the paper into a well-blended pulp. So use a normal blender. It's not gonna hurt it or anything. It's just, paper is just basically just fiber, and it's no different than blending a smoothie together. But my little bullet blender is not exactly strong enough to blend the paper into a well-blended pulp, and that was a problem that came up later on. So yeah, keep that in mind, and onwards with the tutorial. Now, this isn't a part of these directions that I'm going off of for this particular one, but I have seen it a few times in other things, so I'm gonna do something special for my paper. I've added tea, chamomile tea, to the basin in which the paper is soaking in right now. Let me just throw that one in there now. There we go. And I also have some rosemary to blend into the paper later on. I figured it might give it that little bit of a fragrance to it and give it kind of like a special look to it, kind of my own feel. A lot of the plants that I'm growing right now that you've probably seen in the plant watch, I'm actually growing to put into paper and experiment with. So I'm pretty excited about that. I've actually added a few new plants to Plant Watch ever since, you know, the 2 grocery store plants died. But anyways, you'll hear more about that in the next chit chat. So those are all the materials you need. Let's go ahead and get started. Alright, and welcome to the rest of the tutorial. I actually lost the raw audio for the rest of this. But if you haven't noticed already, the internal mic on my camera is horrifying. Like, I shiver having to listen to it every time. Yeah, we'll just moving on. Moving right along. The first thing you'll need to do is rip up loads of paper and soak it in the water. for about 30 to 40 minutes. I used newspaper that's been sitting on my front porch for the longest time ever. I had some cardstock pieces from making Cthulhu cards, and then just normal paper, honestly, like bad printouts. Luckily, I have a lot of excess paper, let's be honest. But I also added the chamomile tea and the rosemary to this mix, and then I did actually cut open the tea bags, because I figured it might add a little something, you know, nice to the paper. And yeah. The water I used was warm. I feel like that may have helped a little bit, but past that, you just gotta soak that paper. I can't speak ever, sorry. While the paper's soaking, this is a good time to go ahead and make the frame sift thingamabob. I use some old window mesh. Obviously, don't go tearing the window mesh off of, like, your parents' the front door of your house or anything like that. Don't do that. But I had some old window mesh from when we replaced the window in our front door. But I originally started trying to use staples with this. Don't do that. Just trust me on this. Get a hammer and get some tiny window frame, or not window frame. Gosh, guys, I'm just out of it. Get the picture frame, like tiny little nails. Those tend to work perfectly, but at the same time, I was still having issues getting the window mesh to be tight around the frame, and I had a problem where paper was kind of like mushing underneath the frame between the mesh. You'll probably see this later. Alright, so the next part is pulping the paper. Now, obviously, when you get the paper out of the water after soaking it, make sure there's not, like, any sticky stuff you've missed, like paper clips, staples, yeah, that kind of stuff, because you don't want to be putting that into a blender. So just, like, double check as you're pulling it out. Just, yeah, make sure you didn't accidentally do that, because I found a staple in mine before I put it in the blender, thankfully. Anyways, like I mentioned earlier about the blender part of this, use a normal powered, like, blender, because my little bullet blender was not strong enough for this. And I feel like a huge problem that I had later on, spoiler alert, was that the pulp wasn't liquefied enough, I feel like, and well blended enough, especially the rosemary. I really liked having the rosemary in it, but I feel like I actually should have blended, like, the rosemary before I even put it in the water. So yeah, that's where I stand on that. So you're essentially going to be doing a little bit at a time with this paper. You're going to be ripping the paper into even tinier bits as you're putting it into the blender. And don't fill the blender all the way up with the paper. You're going to fill it till it's, like, just half full. And then fill the rest of the blender with warm water, and then run the blender and, like, slowly increase the speed as you do it. You're going to want to blend it well. Like, my issue that I had was that because my bullet blender was so small, I could not blend it well. You want it to be smooth and until there's no flakes of paper remaining, but I feel like mine still wasn't blended enough. So yeah. Next up, you're going to be filling the basin or thing bucket, basically, with water about halfway. You're going to fill it up with just water halfway, and then add, like, a little bit of pulp to the water. My problem was I added all of the pulp to the water, and my paper came out very, very thick. So if you want kind of thinner paper, you're going to have to experiment with this a little bit to figure out what works best, because I don't know if you're going to have the same shape of basin as I do, or the frame, etc., etc. But think about the pulp that's on top of the, like, layer of water, like if it's going to be floating, as kind of the thickness. But yeah, I mean, if you want to make cardboard like I did, just add all of the pulp then. But if you don't want to make cardboard, just add a little bit and kind of try and experiment. I can't speak ever, but yeah. Another little tip that I found on a few websites after I finished making the paper and it kind of turned out awful. Try and remove any large clumps that you just see in there. It'll be a lot smoother in the long run. And if you are making stationery paper, this is important. This is the part where you add the starch. You're going to be adding like 2 teaspoons of liquid starch to the pulp. I accidentally added 2 massive capfuls, which is probably about 2 tablespoons of starch. You don't want to do that. Only add a little bit of starch. It'll just leave the paper still pliable, but, you know, make sure the ink doesn't seep through. And, you know, I made a lot of mistakes, I'm suddenly realizing, but that's okay. I'm making the mistakes so you don't have to. And now we move on to making the legendary paper. That's right, we're making paper finally. So essentially you're going to be immersing the frame into the watery pulp mixture that just looks ever so pleasant. And you're going to level it while it's submerged in that mixture, the goop. And then you're going to move it side to side, kind of like sifting flour almost, except not as vigorous, just very lightly. Just sift it as you bring it up out of the water, and you'll kind of actually start to see it level out and flatten out, essentially, and form your new piece of paper. But if the paper is a bit too thick or thin, you can always add a little bit of pulp to it, you know, just try and resubmerge it, maybe get more pulp in, or if it's too thick, you know, remove some pulp, and that'll happen. That'll work. That'll do. So now we need to remove the excess water from the paper. I used felt. You can also apparently use a piece of flannel. Smooth side down on the frame, on top of the paper, and gently just press down to squeeze out all that excess water. You can use a sponge under, like, on the other side of the screen, and then just periodically, like, wring out the sponge, because it'll soak up quite a bit of water. You won't believe how much water is actually in that paper. But you want to be kind of gentle with it, and I was not. So I'm wondering if that may have had an issue. Like I said, I'm starting to realize a lot of mistakes I made as I'm recording this. So yeah, sponge on the bottom, felt on the top, lightly, ever so gently, and yeah. Now, my recommendation with this next part, we're going to be removing the paper from the screen. So the first piece of paper that I removed from the screen, I did it like immediately after I was done sponging and felt, you know, patting out the water. I tried to do it immediately after that because I was like, hey, why not? And it ripped quite a bit. So I don't recommend doing it immediately after you finish that. I would put the screen like maybe in front of a fan for a little bit, maybe even get a hair dryer if you want, and try and dry it a little bit. Like, you want the paper to be a little more dry, and then try and lift it from the screen. I had a lot more success with the second piece of paper that I had made, lifting it out of the screen once it had dried just a little bit. Obviously, when you're peeling the paper off the screen, do it slowly. There's a few methods for if the paper's not coming off easily. Apparently, during my research, I found something about putting it underneath a towel again while it's on the thing and ironing it. Obviously, with the frame that I use, the 5x7 frame, and just the shape of it in general, I wouldn't have been able to do that all that well. But I also don't have any clue if that actually works, so yeah. Now, once you have the paper out of the frame, you're gonna want to set it out on I was trying to say a flat surface to dry. Lay it out on a flat surface to dry. Wow. Alternatively, you can dry it a few other ways as well. I just left my paper out overnight to dry, but you can apparently also iron it or use a hair dryer. You want to use the hair dryer on a low setting. If you're gonna do the ironing when the paper's like still damp but safe, like to move around and whatever, you're gonna want to put the iron on high and dry, like, you know, to dry the paper quickly, and apparently it'll give it a nice shine. Once again, I didn't use that method, so I have no clue, but I will be doing this again and testing this. And that is how you make paper. My paper didn't actually turn out that great. In fact, it turned out kind of lumpy cardboard, basically. I'm kind of disappointed with it, but like I said, this is a learning process. And of course, guys, I'm not an expert. Like, it should be fairly obvious. This is my first time trying to make paper, and it is so very much a trial and error thing. That's why I didn't put any, like, major tutorial overlays throughout this video. If you want to make paper, I highly recommend looking up a few different how-tos, like, you know, different tutorials on the internets, and figuring out, like, what the, you know, the basics of it, because, like, you are gonna have to do this multiple times in order to finally get a proper piece of paper, most likely. So, yep. That's how to make paper. Like I said, I'm definitely going to be doing this again, and I'll try and document that a little bit. It won't be to the full extent of this video, but hopefully it turns out better next time and not horrifying gray cardboard. Anyways, guys, thank you so very much for watching this video. If you enjoy what I'm doing here on this channel, be sure to let me know. And of course, tell me what you think of my paper. And if you do try and make your own paper, let me know how it goes. Send me some pictures and give me some tips. Like, tell me what you did that I didn't, like, if it turned out better than mine. Because, like I said, I want to make my own paper for my, Cthulhu paper and more business, and I'm definitely gonna figure this out. Anyways, guys, have a great rest of your day. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video.